saying, and you guys were picking up on the fact that Art thought that Bass Reeves was this Hollywood character, right? You guys were getting that. And as Art actually put it, he said, I hadn't even seen anything like that in a Hollywood movie. Yet, when I was listening to Tom Joyner made a statement, and I know that you mentioned it in your book, and it's not quite thoroughly researched or proven to be 100% accurate, I should say. Yet there is a hunch, there is a suspicion that the Lone Ranger is based off of Bass Reeves. So you got to tell us a little bit more about that. How is that possible?
Okay, very good. Actually, I did not think about the analogy until my first book came out, Black, Red, and Deadly. And I used to work at Loyola University. And I used to spend a lot of time in the library. And so I started trying to find out all I could on the Lone Ranger. The Lone Ranger became the most popular radio show in the United States during the 1930s and 1940s. I mean, it was premier. And I knew, because I watched the Lone Ranger as a kid. I knew that he had, Tonto as a sidekick. I knew he had this black mask. I knew that he used to give out these silver bullets and do this whole thing. And then I knew, too, that he worked in disguise all the time. Well, after I finished the book, I knew Bass Reeves worked in disguise all the time. I knew that Bass would work with Indian sidekick quite a bit. And I knew people didn't remember his name. They just called him the Black Marshal. And I said, well, this is kind of interesting. Let me see what I can find. And so in doing more research, and every time I go to Oklahoma, I'd always ask people, white, black, Indian, or whatever, do you have any Bass Reeves stories in the family? And sometimes people would get caught off guard. So this one time there was a white gentleman who worked for the Tulsa court system, juvenile court system. And I asked him, and he kind of bucked, and he looked at me, he said, yeah, there's a story about Bass in the family. He said, when my grandfather was a little kid, Bass showed up with two white men and an Indian. And he said that they were looking for the Daltons. And Bass asked if my grandfather could take him out to every place where the Dalton gang might could hide out in the near vicinity. And he said, yeah, he was glad to do that. And then Bass asked if they could feed his crew that he had with him. And they said they'd be glad to do that also. He said that Bass gave his great-grandparents a silver dollar for doing that. And then Bass gave his grandfather a silver dollar for showing him the little places where people could possibly hide out. Well, that right away tipped me off that Bass giving out this silver dollar, and they said, well, that was too much money for doing that, but that was a sign that Bass was giving silver dollars out as part of his persona. And the Lone Ranger gave out silver bullets for people to remember him by. And so that was a tie-in. And then I looked at the criminal case record where Bass went on trial for shooting his cook, which was the darkest period of his life. And the cook had threatened to shoot his gray horse. Well, a gray horse can look from anywhere from near white to near black. And so it's quite possible that Bass was riding a white horse during one period of his career as a deputy U.S. Marshal, a la the silver that the Lone Ranger rode. And then it got real interesting because Detroit was the spot where the Lone Ranger jumped off in 1933 as a radio show. Detroit was also the place where the majority of outlaws that Bass arrested in the 1890s went to Detroit House of Correction. So it was a tie-in with Detroit. So, and then I was a professor named Ravitch out in Wyoming. He told me that he had heard a descendant of the gentleman that started the radio show say that they were aware of this black lawman in the Indian Territory that had these same attributes. Now, it was a long time off. He was, way up in age, and he said he did this as a college student in Florida, somewhere where he heard this. But in my book, I put the analogies together, and I stated we can't prove conclusively, but Bass is the closest thing to the Lone Ranger that exists in reality. Many of the same type of attributes. He had to have an Indian sidekick. Because he was in the Indian Territory, and federal law mandated you had to have one posseman with you whenever you went into the field. And many times he took an Indian with him when he did that. they gave the Lone Ranger, as I read, Tonto because they said they needed to give him a foil or somebody that he could talk to. But they picked the Potawatomi Indian, and the Potawatomi Indians were from the Indian Territory, and that's what Tonto was supposed to be, a Potawatomi. So it was just kind of interesting. One of the things that happened, though, when the movie came out this past spring, The Lone Ranger, I got contacted by quite a few newspapers, mainly in Europe. I got contacted by CNN, the London Bureau, the Daily Telegraph in London, and the New York Daily News, and they all ran real long articles based on this analogy I had between Bass and the Lone Ranger. And it created quite a bit of excitement.